The two farms shared a fence line running 3/4 of a mile along the section road in Reno County, Kansas. Flat ground, mostly tilled loam, the kind of soil that produced reliable winter wheat in a reliable year and told you nothing useful about what an unreliable year would do. In October of 1982, both men planted. In October of 1983, only one of them did. That difference, one planting season, one decision, that is the whole story. But the story does not begin in October of 1983. It begins in the spring of that year when the winter wheat came up short and the government offered both men a way to think differently about what farming a section of Kansas ground was actually for. Walt had farmed the east half of that section since 1971, when he had bought 320 acres from a retiring neighbor at $20-40 per acre and added it to the 160 he had inherited from his father's estate the previous year. His operation was wheat and grain sorghum rotated. He was 51 years old in 1982 and had farmed Reno County ground his entire adult life, which meant he had seen the dry years and the wet years and the years that started one way and finished another. He knew what his ground sorghum will do. He also knew what it looked like in late October when the soil moisture was wrong. His wheat yields through the 1970s had averaged 36 to 39 bushels per acre on the sandy loam that dominated his east fields and the tighter clay ground in the northwest corners that held moisture longer, but rained slower in wet springs. He knew which fields tilted which way. He knew the creek draw on the south end that went wet in February and stayed wet through March in a normal moisture year. And he knew that in a dry year that same draw produced his worst stand because the water table that usually sprained reported it was not there. He had lost a partial crop to drought in 1974 and a partial crop to a late freeze in 1977. Both times he had rebuilt from the settlement sheet and planted the following fall without changing his fundamental approach. What he had changed after 1977 was his habit of reality. NG the extended forecasts more carefully in September before the planting decision was made and before the seed was in the ground. In September of 1982, the extended forecast was not what he wanted to see. Across the fence, Earl Neff had farmed the west 320 acres since 1968. His operation was strainin', upshirt identically to Walt's. Wheat and milo, same rotation, comparable acreage, similar yield history. They had been neighbors for 14 years. They did not farm together, but they watched the same sky and pulled from the same aquifer and sold their wheat to the same elevator in Hutchinson. That they did not share, was the same answer to the question that the USDA's payment-in-kind program put in front of every wheat farmer in Kansas in the fall of 1982. The PIC program, introduced as an emergency measure to address the grain surpluses that had been building since the late 1970s, offered participating farmers a straightforward trade. Idle a specified percentage of your base acreage. In return, receive government-held commodity stocks equal to a calculated portion of what that acreage would have produced at your established yield history. No planting, no input cost, no weather risk, just a payment, calculated on paper, delivered in commodity certificates that could be redeemed or sold. The program was not subtle about what it was offering. It was offering farmers the ability to convert their yield history into cash without planting a crop. In the language of agricultural policy, an acreage reduction measure, and in the language of a Reno County farmer looking at subsoil moisture readings in October of 1982, something considerably more specific than that. Earl had run the numbers 3 times across 2 evenings in early September using the PIC program's established yield formula and the commodity price the USDA had set for the program's wheat payment calculation. He had also run the numbers on what a planted crop would return at 3 different yield scenarios. 38 bushels per acre, his historical average, 28 bushels, the low end of what a Street 2 year might produce. 20 bushels, the kind of number that a severe drought year left in the fields. At 38 bushels and a price of $3.20, planting returned more than the PIC payment. At 28 bushels, the two outcomes were close enough that the decision turned on how you value the certainty of the program versus the uncertainty of the field. At 20 bushels, planting returned less than the pick on any price assumption he could justify. The subsoil moisture reading from the county extension office distributed to cooperating farmers in the second week of September showed the Reno County average at 62% of normal. 62% was not a number that predicted a 20-bushel crop by itself, but it was a number that shifted Earl's probability assessment away from the 38-bushel scenario and toward the middle range. He signed the piquet paperwork. On September 19th, his calculation was straightforward. The PCOP payment on his base wheat acreage, calculated on his 5-year average yield of 38 bushels per acre, came to approximately $4 per bushel equivalent at the program's commodity price, applied to the acreage he agreed to idle, against a projected cash cost of $62 per acre to plant, fertilize, and maintain a wheat crop through to harvest. The PCOP payment offered a return without the exposure. He was not, by his own accounting, optimistic about the 1983 season. The fall of 1982 had been dry across the southern plains. The subsoil moisture in Reno County was significantly below the 10-year average. The extended forecast from the National Weather Service, the kind of forecast that agricultural lenders and extension agents circulated in the fall, not the kind that changed week to week. It showed below normal precipitation probability for the region through the winter and into spring. Earl had seen dry falls before. Most of them had recovered through winter moisture. Some had not. The ones that had not produced wheat yields in the low 20s against a normal of 38. At those yield levels, the math on planting did not work regardless of what the price did. The piquet payment was certain. The 1983 harvest was not. Walt did not sign up. His reasoning was different from Earl's, and it was not wrong. It was not wrong. It was a different reading of the same set of facts. The same soil moisture deficit, the same extended forecast, the same PCOP payment calculation. All of it filtered through a different set of assumptions about what the winter and spring would bring. Walt had watched the wheat price through 1981 and 1982 with attention that went beyond casual market awareness. The Soviet grain embargo, imposed in 1980 and lifted in 1981, had disrupted export patterns in ways that he believed were not fully resolved. The global wheat supply situation, which the USDA's quarterly reports addressed in language that Walt read carefully and translated into his own projections, suggested to him that the downward price pressure of the late 1970s was not permanent. He thought wheat was underpriced relative to its export demand fundamentals. He also believed, based on nothing more scientific than 41 years of living in Reno County and watching the weather move across the flat country from the southwest, that the dry fall of 1982 was not a reliable predictor of the spring of 1983. He had seen too many dry falls recover to treat the October subsoil reading as a verdict, so he planted all of his wheat base. His reasoning was not optimism in the careless sense. It was a different weighting of the same uncertainty. Walt had run his own numbers in September and had concluded that the subsoil deficit, while real, was within the range that winter moisture could recover. He had seen the county's subsoil readings come in below 70% of normal in October and then recover to adequate levels by January in 1976 and again in 1979. Both those years had produced reasonable wheat crops. He had also looked at the price side of the calculation with a different emphasis than Earl had. The Soviet Union had been a major buyer of American wheat in the late 1970s, and the disruption caused by the 1980 embargo and its aftermath had left the export market in a condition that Walt believed was tightening. The PCOP program itself, by paying farmers to idle acres, was going to reduce the national wheat crop. Less supply and stable or growing export demand pointed in one direction. He thought the price was going to move. He also thought his ground was going to produce something, even in a dry year. His yield floor in the worst years he could remember was 22 to 24 bushels per acre. At 24 bushels and a price above $3.50, his gross revenue covered his variable costs with margin to spare for his fixed overhead. The risk he was accepting was the range between 20 bushels and 24. He did not believe 1983 was going to produce a 20-bushel crop. His input cost for the 1982-83 wheat crop, seed, fertilizer, herbicide, fuel, and equipment, ran $61 per acre on 280 acres of his wheat ground. Total cash outlay, $17,080. He planted in the second week of October in soil that was dry enough that germination took longer than he wanted, and the stand was uneven through November. The winter of 1982-83 was, in the end, drier than average across most of Reno County. The snowpack that typically provided moisture, recharge to the subsoil, arrived late and thin. By February, the wheat that had established stood in ground that had not recharged the level Walt had expected. The plants were alive. They were not thriving. In March, a late cold snap, temperatures dropping to 14 degrees Fahrenheit over 390's, moved through south-central Kansas. The wheat that had been stressed by dry conditions was more vulnerable to freeze damage than a healthy stand would have been. The damage was not uniform across Walt's fields. The lower ground, where moisture had been marginally better, came through with mowed rate damage. The upland areas, where the soil had been driest since October, showed significant tiller kill. Walt walked his fields in the last week of March and made his assessments. He had been watching the fields since February, when the cold had settled in and the moisture that should have been, and recharging the subsoil had not arrived. The wheat had gone dormant properly in December and had broken dormancy in late February on schedule, but the tiller count on his sample plots was running 15 to 20% below what he recorded in a normal year. The March cold snap confirmed what the tiller count had suggested. He walked the damaged areas carefully, pulling plants and examining the crowns. On his northwest field, the one with the tighter clay subsoil that typically held moisture better, the damage was moderate. The crowns were stressed but alive in most of the stand. He estimated field would recover to 28 to 32 bushels per acre if the rest of the spring cooperated. On his sandy loam ground to the east, where the subsoil had been driest since October, the crown damage was more severe. He walked 200 yards of row and counted. In the worst sections, he was losing 40% of the tillers. That ground was going to come in well below his normal average. He did not abandon the crop. You did not abandon a wheat crop in March in Kansas on the basis of a field walk. But he revised his harvest estimate downward from the 34 to 38 bushels he had projected in the fall, and he noted in the farm records that the moisture deficit had been more persistent than he had expected when he made the planting decision. The stand was salvageable. It would not produce a normal crop. By May, when the wheat was heading out and the yield potential was becoming visible in the field, Walt's best estimate for his harvest was 24 to 27 bushels per acre, against a normal of 38, against an input cost structure that had been built for a 38-bushel crop. That spring, the wheat price was doing something that neither Walt nor Earl had fully predicted. It was rising. The combination of reduced planted acres across the plains, a direct result of PIC program participation, which had idled significant wheat acreage nationally, combined with continued strong export demand, had tightened the supply picture faster than the USDA's fall projections had suggested. By the time the Kansas harvest was approaching in June, the soft red winter wheat price at the Kansas City Board of Trade had moved to $3.74 per bushel. The hard red winter price, which governed the Hutchinson Elevator's posted price, was tracking near $3.65. Walt had been right about the price direction. He had been wrong about the yield. His 280 acres of wheat came in at an average of 26 bushels per acre, toward the lower end of his March estimate, reflecting the late-season stress that the dry winter had left in the stand. At $3.65 per bushel, His gross revenue from wheat was $26,572. His variable cost had been $17,080. His gross margin on the wheat crop was $9,492. That number covered his wheat ground share of his land payment and left approximately $2,800 toward his fixed overhead. It was not a good year for Walt Ogren's wheat operation. It was not a disaster either. It was the number you arrived at when you were right about the price and wrong about the yield, and the two errors partially offset each other. Earl had received his piquet payment in commodity certificates valued at approximately $12,400, calculated on his 280 acres of base wheat acreage at the program's established yield, D commodity price. He had redeemed the certificates through the Commodity Credit Corporation in May, converting them to cash at a small discount. He had spent $0 on wheat inputs for the 1982-83 crop year. His net from the piquet program on his wheat base was $12,400. I want to stop here because $400. I want to stop here because it's easy to read this as Earl made the smart call and Walt made the wrong one. The numbers in June of 1983 support that reading on the surface. Earl netted more from his wheat base than Walt did, without spending $1 on inputs, without watching the stand struggle through a dry winter, without walking Engie fields in March counting damaged grounds. But that reading requires ignoring something important. Walt had been correct about the price direction. Wheat went to $365 in June of 1983. If his yield had come in at 38 bushels per acre, at the normal level his operation was designed to produce, his gross margin would have been $40,720 on 280 acres against Earl's $12,400 PIK payment. The yield was the variable that decided the outcome, not the price call, not the planting decision in isolation. The yield that the 1982-83 winter produced on stressed ground. Earl had not predicted TRT yield correctly either. He had predicted it would be poor, which it was, but he had not predicted the price would rise as sharply as it did. His PK calculation had assumed the wheat price would hold near $3.20. At $3.65, his certificates were calculated on a below-market price basis. He left some value on the table relative to what a full crop at the harvest price would have returned had the yield been normal. Neither man had made a mistake. They had looked at the same dry October soil in the same county and reached different probability assessments about what the winter would do and dribble at the price would do and what the combination of those two unknowns meant for their operations. Their information was identical. Their yield histories were comparable. Their operations were the same size on the same ground in the same county. The only thing that separated their decisions was where. Each man placed his confidence in an October forecast that neither one could verify until the following June. Earl had weighted the yield risk higher. Walt had weighted the price opportunity higher. The winter had validated Earl's yield assessment and Walt's price assessment, which meant both men had been partially right, and the outcome depended entirely on which variable mattered more. In 1983, in a drought year with a price rally, the yield mattered more. They talked about it that fall the way men who had farmed the same road for 14 years talked about it the previous season. After the farmed the 14 years talked about the previous season. After the farm, next one's planting decisions were already made and there was nothing left to argue about. Earl said the pike had worked out better than he had expected, given where the price went. He said he had not predicted the rally and acknowledged that a normal yield at those prices would have put Walt well ahead. Walt said his yield number was the one he had not been able to control. He said the stand had looked recoverable in November and he had believed it would recover. He said he would look more carefully at the subsoil numbers in October before making the same call again. He did not say he had been wrong to plant. He said the ground had not cooperated. Earl did not say he had been right to take the PK. He said the PK had been the right call for his operation, given what he knew in September, and that if the same conditions presented again, he would make the same decision. Both statements were accurate. They were standing at the fence line when they had this conversation, the same fence line that ran 3/4 of a mile along the section road, the same one they had been watching weather move across for 14 years. On the east side, Walt's wheat ground was already prepared for the October 1983 planting. He was going to plant again. He had studied his soil moisture more carefully this fall. He liked what he saw better than he had liked it in 1982. On the west side, Earl was evaluating the 1983 PIC program announcement, which had come out in August. The terms were different from 1982. He was running the numbers again. Neither man told the other what to do. They had both done that already. Would you risk planting for a potential price rally, or hold back and take the certainty of the program payment? What would you have done in Walt's position? In Earl's?